Joe Massino is probably the last boss of the Bonanno family who witnessed the power of the American mafia. He went through many twists and turns with his mafia family, personally pulling it out of the hole after undercover agent Joe Pistone and reorganizing it, restoring respect on the streets. However, in the end, it was he who hammered the last nail into its coffin. Meet Joe Massino on the other side of the law. Joseph Charles Massino was born on January 10, 1943, in New York City. Joseph's father, Anthony Massino, was a fruit vendor, and his mother, Adelina, was a housewife. In addition to Joe, there were two other brothers in the family, John and Anthony. Massino was not particularly enthusiastic about his studies and dropped out of school in 7th grade, spending his days hanging out in his neighborhood of Maspeth, Queens, New York. It was here that he earned his first street reputation and met the nephew of the future boss of the Bonanno family, Philip "Rusty" Rastelli. At 17, Massino married a girl named Josephine Vitali, who soon gave birth to his daughter. Josephine had a younger brother named Salvatore, with whom Massino developed a good relationship and who would later play an important role in our story today. To support his family, Massino needed a steady income, so he decided to buy a food truck and start selling food to local factory workers. There were many warehouses and factories in Maspeth and the surrounding area, whose workers wanted to eat but didn't have time to cook. It's possible that Joe chose this type of income because he was already quite close to the Philip Rastelli family. We've already mentioned his acquaintance with his nephew, and by the time Massino came of age, he was also seen in contact with Rastelli's brother, Carmine Rastelli. The fact is that Rusty Rastelli was involved in union racketeering, organizing an association of street vendors where he forcibly drove all local sellers and forced them to pay $15 a week for membership in the association. With such connections in the industry, Massino did not have to worry about getting the best job. However, selling food from a food truck was not his only source of income. Joe also took bets on sports and gave out loans. He probably did all this under the patronage of the Bonanno family, represented by Rastelli. By the age of 20, the FBI had added truck hijackings with various goods to his file. In the late 1960s, after serving in the army, Salvatore Vitali returned home, and Massino brought him into the food truck to sell food and take bets. Around the same time, Joe also began his killing spree. The reason why he killed Tommy Zumo, a partner of the Bonanno family, is unclear, but Rastelli was not happy about it, which is why Massino hid his involvement in the case from Rusty. We've already mentioned that Joe was involved in truck hijacking. By the early 1970s, his team was considered one of the best in the business. They mainly targeted trucks carrying goods from Kennedy Airport. Massino's methods, however, were not particularly original. Our viewers have heard about them in the videos about John Gotti and Henry Hill. The Bonanno family, and Joe in particular, had their own people at the airport and among the truck drivers. Most often, they were hooked because of debts that arose from loans from gangsters or gambling losses. To pay off their debts, such people either leaked information about the truck with the goods that Massino's men were robbing, or they were drivers. They handed over the truck itself, simulating a robbery. The stolen trucks were then given to a prearranged location and quickly unloaded, after which they were abandoned. The goods were sold to local stores or sometimes even retail chains at below wholesale prices. In addition to truck theft, Joe opened a small delicatessen, J&J Catering. Massino also managed not just one food truck, but an entire fleet of vehicles. Adjacent to the store was a space that Massino registered as J&S and turned into a small social club. Massino also founded a trucking company, MVP Trucking. During those same years, Massino met another young thief from the Gambino family, John Gotti, and often helped him when he needed to hide a stolen truck or quickly find a buyer. In March 1975, Massino was tried for the first time. His men stole a truck when its driver parked it and left for a couple of minutes. When the driver realized that the truck had been stolen, he immediately reported it to the police. Less than an hour later, a police officer spotted the truck at Maspeth. He began to follow it and saw the following scene. A man in a car stopped the truck, got out, jumped onto the running board, and said something quickly to the driver and drove away. This man was Joe Massino, who apparently ordered the truck driver to abandon the vehicle and try to escape, which the driver did. However, the cop caught up with him and arrested him. The arrested driver was one of Massino's crew members, Raymond Ween. As the cop was leading Ween to his car, Joe himself drove up and asked what was going on. The cop ordered him to stop and said that he was also under arrest, but Massino drove off in an unknown direction, only to return later and turn himself in. Massino and Ween were charged with conspiracy to commit theft and possession of stolen goods. However, after reviewing the case file, their lawyer concluded that his client's arrest had been unlawful. The fact is that several years before Massino's arrest, the so-called Miranda warning was passed, according to which law enforcement officers were required to inform suspects upon arrest that they had the right to remain silent, etc. Now, thanks to movies, the phrase "anything you say can be used against you" is perceived as a cliché and a stereotype, but in practice, this rule was sometimes not followed. On February 10, 1977, during a court hearing, Massino stated that his rights had not been explained to him. Law enforcement officials were only concerned with bringing him to their office and interrogating him. The court ruled that due to violations during the arrest, it would not accept the testimony Massino gave on the day of his arrest, confirming that he knew Ween. Joe left the courtroom and went home, while Ween was sentenced to several months in jail. Changes were also taking place in the Bonanno family. In February 1974, Philip Rastelli became the boss of the family. Although he had the support of the commission, which recognized him as the boss, all the power was concentrated in the hands of Carmine "Lilo" Galante, whose video you can watch on our channel. Rastelli was serving a prison sentence at the time. Galante hated Rastelli. He sought to strengthen his position in the family by eliminating all of Rastelli's close associates and confidants. For example, in March 1975, Rusty's nephew was killed. Although the investigation concluded that he committed suicide, everyone in the family knew it was a murder ordered by Galante. On June 14, 1977, Massino was accepted into the family during a ceremony conducted by Carmine Galante. Despite the fact that Joe was on the team of James Galante, Lilo's nephew, Massino did not turn his back on Rusty. He constantly visited him in prison and passed on his messages to the family. Upon learning of Massino's visits, Galante summoned him and ordered him to stop visiting him. However, Massino refused, explaining that Rastelli was very close to him and he could not abandon him. However, Galante had made many enemies, and even other families wanted Lilo dead. Therefore, when Massino, on Rastelli's behalf, submitted a request to the commission to kill Galante, it was approved. On July 12, 1979, Galante was killed. After Carmine Galante's murder, Massino was promoted to capo. Also, forced to run the family behind bars, Rusty appointed one of the old capos, Salvatore Farrugia, nicknamed Sally Fruits, as street boss. But the family members understood that Farrugia was a nominal and temporary figure. Three factions fought for power. One, formerly headed by Joe Massino and Dominic "Sonny Black" Napolitano, remained loyal to Rastelli. Another faction was led by three capos, Alphonse "Sonny" Red Indelicato, Philip Giacone, and Dominic Trinchera, who had the support of the Genovese family. The third force was the Zips, members of the family who had been brought over from Sicily by Galante. A few months after Galante's murder, all the capos of the family met at least twice to settle their differences. However, they were unable to reach a compromise and tensions continued to rise. The dispute was referred to the commission, which ruled that all parties should avoid bloodshed and wait until Rastelli was released from prison. In the spring of 1981, Massino's old friend and member of the Colombo family, Carmine "Tutti" Franzese, told Joe that Sonny Red and his crew had started buying automatic weapons and were preparing for war. Franzese also heard Indelicato allegedly say that he needed to finish what Galante had started and take the family away from Rastelli. Massino decided not to wait for the blow, but to strike first. In order not to gain a reputation as a lawbreaker, he decided to enlist the support of the bosses of other New York families, talking about this with Paul Castellano of the Gambino family and Carmine Persico of the Colombo family. As Massino himself later admitted, they responded with something like, "You have to defend yourself, so do what you have to do." Massino also met with a man from the Zip faction, Capo Santos Giordano, and persuaded him to join the conspiracy. Giordano helped Massino with the hitmen. They were three Zips from Montreal. Interestingly, while developing the murder plan, Dominic Napolitano suggested that Massino involve one of his associates, Donnie Brasco, in the killing. The same FBI agent whose infiltration of the Bonanno family was the subject of the film of the same name. But Massino flatly refused this proposal. He did not trust Brasco and advised his team members to stay as far away from him as possible, even forbidding them to sit at the same table with him at joint events. To lure his enemies into a trap, Massino decided to hold another meeting to settle disputes, scheduling it for May 5, 1981. In order to not arouse Indelicado's suspicions that the meeting might be a setup, neutral capos Joseph Zaccarelli and Nicholas DeStefano were also invited. The meeting was to take place in the Dyker Heights neighborhood of Brooklyn. There was a public dining hall there, which the Gambino family had converted into an illegal bar and casino. About 10 people were already waiting for the 3 capos there, 4 of whom were hitmen. Shortly before the meeting, Massino handed out ski masks to the hitmen and ordered them to hide in the cloakroom. The masks were needed so that the neutral capos, Zaccarelli and DeStefano, would not be able to identify them later. The killers were to jump out of the cloakroom at a signal. The chief of the shooters, Zip Gerlando Shasha, who was present at the meeting, was to run his hand through his hair. 2 blocks away from the building, another man with a radio was sitting in a car. He was supposed to warn Massino about the arrival of Indelicado and company. On the evening of May 5th, Sonny Black met Indelicado, Giacone, and Trinchera, and drove them to the meeting place, after which he waited in the car. When they entered the room, one of the shooters, pistol in hand, rushed out shooting. "This is a robbery! Everyone against the wall!" The killers were supposed to line them up against the wall and shoot them, but things did not go according to plan. The shooting started early and was chaotic. It was a miracle that none of the conspirators were killed, with only one suffering a serious wound to the back. The only ones who did not come out of the room alive were Indelicado, Giacone, and Trinchera. So, despite the failure of the original plan, the goal was achieved. The bodies were then loaded into a van, and Sonny Black handed them over to Gotti's men, who were supposed to help get rid of them. However, they did a poor job of their assignment. 19 days after the execution, Indelicado's body was found in a shallow grave in a vacant lot on the edge of Ozone Park. There was only one problem left: Sonny Red, Bruno Indelicado's son. He had to be eliminated so that he would not seek revenge, and Sonny Black assigned this task to Donnie Brasco. Although Pistone believed that as a member of the family he could be of enormous benefit to the FBI, his superiors felt that he was now at too great a risk. He was given a contract to kill, and the victim knew about it and could strike first. Therefore, at the end of July 1981, the FBI decided to remove Pistone from undercover work. And on July 30th, FBI agents met with Sonny Black. To prove to him that Pistone was indeed from the Bureau, they showed him a photo of smiling Pistone in the company of FBI agents. On the same day, Napolitano met with the members of his team and told them the latest news about Donnie Brasco. Everyone was puzzled, and one of the team members even claimed that the FBI must have kidnapped Donnie and forced him to pose for group photos. Napolitano and his team decided to keep this information secret for the time being and set out to find Brasco. When the search proved fruitless, he told them what had happened. In particular, for allowing the agent to infiltrate the family, Sonny Black was killed on August 17, 1981. Sonny was invited to a meeting at the home of a Bonanno family associate named Filicomo. Present there were Filicomo, Frank Lino, a soldier of the family, and Frank Coppa, a capo who killed Napolitano. In the film Donnie Brasco, there's a moment at the end when Lefty Ruggiero is getting ready for the meeting, from which he will not return, and leaves some of his belongings behind. In reality, this is how Napolitano got ready. A few hours before the meeting, realizing that he would not return from it, Sonny Black left his diamond ring, a wad of cash, and the keys to his apartment with the bartender at the bar, where his team was gathering. The family was also going to deal with Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, who brought Brasco into Napolitano's team. Ruggiero was summoned to the meeting, but the FBI found out about it and arrested him before he got there. He was charged with racketeering and weapons possession. Another member of the family, Anthony Mira, was less fortunate. He was the first member of the Bonanno family with whom Brasco made contact. He was eliminated in 1982. Massino, although not a suspect in the Napolitano murder, was still targeted by the authorities. They were going to bring charges against him, so Joe, acting preemptively, left New York. This allowed him to avoid arrest, for which a warrant was issued in the summer of 1982. He first went to Hampton, a summer resort on the east side of Long Island, and 2 weeks later left for Milford, Pennsylvania. Massino had initially planned to leave New York for a few weeks at most, but his life on the run dragged on. All this time, Massino kept in touch with his team through Vitali by phone. Before leaving New York, Massino gave Vitali the address and numbers of 5 payphones in Queens, each of which was assigned a letter. Whenever Massino needed to give Vitali an assignment, he would call him and tell him the letter of the payphone from which Sal was going to call him back. Later, Anthony Casso used the same communication system, which you can see in the video on our channel. While on the run, Massino, who had already become the underboss, decided to deal with one of the capos of the Zip faction, Cesare Bonventre. He was gaining influence and was a potential threat to Rastelli's power. Bonventre was originally with Carmine Galante but betrayed him and helped in the assassination attempt on his boss. After that, he was made capo, the youngest in the family at the time. Bonventre made his money from heroin trafficking, and his name appeared in the indictment in the high-profile Pizza Connection case. He was also one of the family's hitmen, with about 20 victims to his name. In general, despite being in his early 30s, he was a serious and intelligent guy. Perhaps Massino made the right decision in getting rid of him, since Bonventre had already betrayed Galante. Cesare was killed in 1984, and his body was dismembered and placed in barrels in a warehouse in New Jersey, where it was discovered in April of that year. By this time, Massino's lawyer had informed him that he had nothing to fear, that the authorities had nothing on him, and that he could turn himself in. In July 1984, Joe did just that. The first charge was for murder. The evidence in court was based on the testimony of Agent Pistone, the same Donnie Brasco, and a tape recording in which Benjamin Ruggiero could be heard discussing the murder with Pistone. In June 1985, Massino was charged under the RICO Act. Together with Rastelli, he was accused of racketeering. In the spring of 1986, Joe appeared in federal district court in Brooklyn as a co-defendant with Rastelli. After Rastelli's arrest in 1975, Massino was put in charge of the truckers union, whose vice president was Rastelli's brother-in-law, Anthony Giliberti. Although Massino owed a lot to Rusty, his relationship with Giliberti was rocky from day one. In 1982, when the feds took over the union, Massino, fearing that Giliberti would start snitching, sent a team of hitmen after him. The union leader suffered 9 gunshot wounds but survived and became the main witness at the trial. Joseph Pistone also testified against Massino. As a result, in 1987, Rastelli was sentenced to 12 years in prison and Massino to 10. It was his first prison term. Joe was ultimately acquitted in the previously announced murder case. In the same year, 1987, Massino stood trial on charges of conspiracy to murder 3 capos. The prosecutor offered Massino 12 years in prison if he pleaded guilty to at least 1 murder. Joe refused the deal, even though he could have faced up to 20 years. The trial ended in victory for Massino's lawyers. The jury acquitted him of conspiracy to commit murder on the grounds that his guilt had not been proven. After putting Rastelli and Massino behind bars, the FBI believed that the Bonanno family, if not destroyed, had been dealt a blow from which it could not recover anytime soon. In 1987, the FBI merged its 2 teams that were overseeing the Bonanno and Colombo families. In fact, only 5 people remained in the FBI who worked specifically on Bonanno. The family did indeed suffer a powerful blow, but it was not destroyed. As for Massino, he essentially became the head of the family since Rastelli was unable to fully lead the family. He was diagnosed with cancer. On June 24, 1991, Philip Rastelli died, and Massino was unanimously elected boss of the family. Sometime later, in November 1992, he was released from prison on parole. To be eligible for parole, Massino had to show a source of legal income. Officially, Joe was listed as a consultant for King Caterers, a company that prepared snacks and baked goods for food trucks. This company was under the wing of Massino and Vitali, and to disguise its payments from the tax authorities, a front company called Queen's Catering was created. Through it, Massino received a single payment of $300,000 from King Caterers and received $17,500 monthly. Massino showed up at the company once a week, played cards, and sometimes for fun made sauce. Thanks to his hard work, Massino was able to not only solve the issue with his parole, but also present tax documents proving that he could afford to maintain a $750,000 home and make various investments. Massino's personal fortune is believed to have exceeded $10 million. Once free, Massino began working to revive the Bonanno family from the ashes, like a phoenix. The Brasco case not only hit the family hard in terms of prison sentences for its members, but also served as a reason for their expulsion from the commission, as well as the removal of other mafia families, which resulted in the loss of a number of joint earnings. Massino set about restoring the organization's economic stability. For example, it was under Massino that the Bonanno family became involved in a stock market fraud. Massino also devoted a great deal of energy to ensuring security. He closed almost all the family's social clubs so that the FBI would not be able to eavesdrop on the gangsters at their regular meeting places. Meetings of senior members were held either far from New York in the interior of the country or in neighboring countries. Remembering the catastrophic damage Joseph Pistone had done to the family, Massino decided that all potential family members must have been acquainted with current members for at least 8 years. Massino also actively encouraged his people to bring their relatives into the family. Joe believed that the family ties would reduce the likelihood of informants. All teams, now divided into cells, were forbidden from discussing business with each other. This way, if an informant or secret agent infiltrated a team, they would not be able to obtain information about other family members. At the same time, Massino understood that no matter how hard he tried to ensure security, arrests were inevitable. For such cases, he established a fund to pay for lawyers, to which each family member had to contribute $100 per month. Also, under no circumstances were family members allowed to communicate with law enforcement officials. Even the recently introduced mobile phones were banned. Massino believed that the smaller the phone model, the easier it was to hide a bug in it. Joe also established a special committee of senior family members who could make decisions and settle disputes on behalf of the bosses. From then on, orders to the captains were given not by the boss, but by the chairman of the committee. No one except a handful of trusted individuals could see or communicate with Massino. Massino himself was rarely seen in public and tried not to attend weddings or funerals of family members. He even went as far as to order his people never to mention his name in conversation. Instead, they were to touch their ears. Joe apparently borrowed this technique from the head of the Genovese family, Vincent Chin Gigante, whom his subordinates referred to simply by touching their chins. Joe even went so far as to ban the use of knives during initiation ceremonies for new members, so that there would be no evidence in the event of a raid by the authorities. Massino restored the Bonanno family's reputation and earnings. The family was even accepted back into the commission. It seemed that now they could rest on their laurels, but the authorities had other plans. In those years, the FBI knew practically nothing about the state of the Bonanno family and Massino's role. For a long time, the Bureau believed that the family was living a miserable existence. In addition, the Bureau had virtually no informants within the family. One of the few people in the FBI at the time who understood that Bonanno could not be discounted was the head of the Bonanno squad, Jack Stubbing. He knew about the precautions Massino had taken, so he decided to start the investigation from a different angle, by looking into his finances. First, the agents needed to compile a list of Joe Massino's assets, as his tax returns only listed his house and the Casablanca restaurant. The agents managed to find out that Massino used the services of the accounting firm Guerin & Guerin. The FBI went to court, which ordered the firm to provide the agents with all documents and account statements related to Massino. The agents also learned that Massino and his accomplices were laundering money using winning lottery tickets. In his tax returns, Joe indicated that he had won the lottery twice. In fact, he bought these winning tickets from the actual winners before they were cashed in. Massino paid more for these tickets than the winnings themselves and received a lottery ticket with a check that could be presented to the tax authorities. But, of course, lottery winnings did not come close to covering all of Massino's earnings. Agents also found several checks, ranging from $5,000 to $17,000, that were written by Sal Vitale's wife, Diana, to Barry Weinberg. Weinberg, a Brooklyn entrepreneur, was one of Richard Cantarella's business partners, another member of the family. In fact, there was little partnership in his relationship. Weinberg was a wealthy man who liked to hang out with gangsters for the thrill and to show off. Cantarella, on the other hand, extorted money from Weinberg under any pretext. Gradually, he began to demand a share of literally everything Weinberg was involved in. Over 2 years, Cantarella forced him to give him about $800,000, and Weinberg, in order to disguise the payments, registered them as loans he had given to Cantarella. The agents paid particular attention to a deal that Weinberg made with Massino himself. Weinberg once owned several parking lots. Massino bought them but paid Weinberg a price well below market value. For example, one of the parking lots was worth about $300,000, but Massino got it for $16,500, which was practically nothing. It turned out that the checks written by Diana Vitale were those payments. This is how the FBI found out that there was a business relationship between Cantarella and Massino. Weinberg was arrested and taken to the FBI office. He was charged with tax evasion for underestimating the sale price of the parking lots. He didn't want to go to prison, so he decided to cooperate with the investigation and wear a recording device. In just over a year, he managed to record about 80 audio cassettes before he and his family were placed in the witness protection program. The Bureau was able to obtain a search warrant for Cantarella's home. There they found numerous documents, including lists of debtors and their payments, as well as tax returns for all 3 parking lots owned by Massino. In 2002, another person was linked to Weinberg. The FBI charged Frank Coppa, a capo in the Bonanno family, with extorting money from Barry Weinberg. Coppa was serving a 3-year sentence at Fort Dix Prison for securities fraud. While Coppa initially faced no more than 5 years in prison, his case now fell under the RICO Act. Frank could have received 20 years in prison and remained behind bars for the rest of his life. In this situation, Coppa decided to cooperate with the investigation. He became the first person to tell agents about the elimination of Sonny Black. Coppa also listed all 3 main participants in the murder of the 3 capos, but Coppa got the most out of Cantarella. Early in his criminal career, Cantarella worked on Coppa's team, and in one of their conversations, bragged to him about how he had helped Sal Vitali kill a man and then dispose of the body. Cantarella also told Coppa in detail that he had been one of the participants in the hit on Anthony Mira. Cantarella was also arrested. He was charged with 15 counts of racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, extortion, money laundering, arson, illegal bookmaking, loan sharking, and kidnapping. In January 2003, Cantarella pleaded guilty to 2 murders and agreed to testify on behalf of the government. He was facing life imprisonment, and to avoid it, he decided to testify against Vitali and Massino. In January 2003, it was Joseph Massino's turn, and he was arrested at his home. It would seem that thanks to the confessions of Coppa and Cantarella, the FBI had enough evidence to send Massino to prison for life. But to give weight to these charges, they needed the confession of Vitali, a man who, in one way or another, was involved in every murder Massino was accused of. In February 2003, Vitali, who had previously been under house arrest on racketeering charges, signed an agreement with the authorities, pleading guilty to 11 murders. He was then the underboss and thus became the highest-ranking member of the mafia since Sammy Gravano, who had decided to cooperate with the investigation. Vitali had a very good memory and described his relatives' crimes to the agents minute by minute. In return, Vitali asked that none of his confessions be used to prosecute Josephine Massino, his sister and Joe's wife. Next in line to testify was James Tartaglione, one of the participants in the execution of 3 capos and the killing of Cesare Bonventre. In 1997, Tartaglione was sentenced to 5 years for usury, and after being released on parole, he decided to give up crime and move to Florida. But now his name had come up in the testimony of Cantarella and Vitali. Therefore, in an attempt to avoid prosecution, Tartaglione contacted the FBI and agreed to become an informant. In September 2003, he arrived in New York, claiming that he had returned to help the family during a difficult time. Then, over the course of several months, Tartaglione wore a recording device and recorded more than 45 conversations with the Bonanno family capos, giving the feds a mountain of evidence against Massino. As a result, in 2004, Joe was additionally charged with the murder of Anthony Mira, and 8 other members of the Bonanno family were arrested. At the trial, Massino's lawyers tried to prove that the government was fabricating charges against Joe to testify a series of costly and unsuccessful investigations over the past 30 years. The lawyers insisted that during years of wiretapping, Massino never incriminated himself and that the FBI had no material evidence that could prove he had committed a crime. As for the family members who testified, the lawyer called them sociopaths who were willing to do anything. Vitali got the worst of it. The lawyer called him crazy, despised by his own people, a madman who hated Joe Massino. The press relished the feud between the relatives, and some journalists even wrote that Massino was going to kill Vitali in prison. However, on July 30th, 2004, it took the jury only 15 minutes to reach a verdict. Massino was found guilty on all 11 counts, including 7 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 2 life terms. All his financial assets and real estate, including the property where his wife and children lived, were also to be confiscated. In addition to all this, Massino could have become the first Italian mafia boss in U.S. history to be sent to death row if the authorities had proven another murder. Within 2 years, almost half of the Bonanno family was either in prison or under investigation. Among those arrested was Vincent Basciano, whom Massino had appointed as temporary boss shortly before the arrest. Baciano managed to get out on bail and visited Massino in prison several times in the fall of 2004. In November 2004, Massino agreed to become an informant. He told agents that he could implicate Baciano in a number of unsolved serious crimes. In early January 2005, Massino recorded 2 conversations with Baciano in prison. The topics of conversation varied widely, but one topic stood out. Baciano suggested that Massino kill Greg Andres, the federal prosecutor who was handling the Bonanno family case, and also confessed to his involvement in the murder of one of his partners, Randolph Pisolo. At the end of January, Baciano was charged with conspiracy to commit murder. In addition to the recordings of his conversations with Baciano, Massino also told agents the location of the remains of Philip Giacone and Dominic Trinchera. Indelicato's remains had been found earlier. For his cooperation, Massino avoided the death penalty and began serving 2 consecutive life sentences. He was also allowed to keep part of his fortune, which allowed his wife and children to keep their home. From 2005 until the last days of his life, Massino testified in several trials, for which the U.S. Department of Justice filed a motion in the summer of 2013 to reduce Massino's sentence, which was granted. The former boss of the Bonanno family spent the last years of his life in the Witness Protection Program. He lived in a prestigious nursing home under the pseudonym Ralph Rogers. On September 14, 2023, Massino died at a rehabilitation center on Long Island at the age of 80.